Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of housekeeping and just let you know a little about the webinar and how it works. So first of all, just wanted to say hello. I'm Jessica Long. I'm here at the Whitney Laboratory tonight, and I'm here with Brenda. We are distancing to show you a little bit about our education marine creatures that we have here that we're going to learn a little bit more about our local animals here in Northeast Florida. So the first thing to let you know is this is a webinar, and if you haven't done a Zoom webinar, you can see us at various times, but we actually can't see your screens. So that allows us to have more people in the call. But what we can do to make sure we can interact is we have a couple ways to join in. One, we're gonna have some polling questions throughout. We have a couple more that are gonna come up. So if you have a chance to click into the poll, you'll see a couple questions as we go through. Second, we have a Q&A question here down below. So if you put your screen into speaker view, that we usually recommend you do that. And then if you want to do the Q&A or have a question that comes up, we'd love to hear from you. So you can write into the Q&A, and I'm going to be posing those questions to Brenda as we learn a little bit more about some of the animals that we showcase here to our students. The next thing to just let you know is at the end, we're also going to do the rest of any other questions. So you'll have a chance then too. So one thing about our education program you may not know is that we share our marine animals with over 5,000 students here in 7 counties. And we really couldn't do it without our docents and the people who participate in our program with Brenda and her team. So we want to thank everyone who participates in that. We really miss being able to do all of that, but we are doing a hybrid education program now. And so if you want to learn a little more about that, please go to our website. I've put our website in the chat. You're welcome to also just email me also, and I can send you information. So coming up, we will have another webinar on November 12th. We'll be having a focus on our sea turtles and our Sea Turtle Hospital with Catherine Eastman. So we hope you can join us for that. A little bit about Brenda tonight. I wanted to introduce our speaker tonight, and that's Brenda Canaliado. She's been with the Whitney Laboratory for 13 years, leading our education program. Our program is focused on STEM education, and we deliver programs at all different age categories. The main one that we are going to be learning a little bit about tonight is some of the animals we use for our K through 6th grade. Brenda not only has been with us 13 years, but she was also a science teacher for 7th graders. If you can imagine, that is a great group to be teaching science to. So I think she should do okay with me. I'm really excited to learn about some of the animals tonight. She did some work at Marine Lab before joining us, and has since taken on the management role of our education programs, leading us forward. So please welcome Brenda, and we're going to get started looking at some of our animals.
Thank you, Jessica. Doing education programs here at the Whitney Lab is a lot of fun, and one way that we keep it exciting is that we do like to use some local Florida invertebrate animals to help talk about an effective way of like comparing and contrasting how these animals might survive every day. Now, depending on who you talk to and how old that person might be, we all might have a different answer on what we need to survive. But we're going to think about 3 things on how these animals, how do they have to protect themselves? How are they going to go after their food and find their food? And one of the most important things is how are they going to get their oxygen? So when I look at this particular phylum right here called Econoderms, which stands for like a spiny body, we have sea urchins and sea stars that are in this phylum right here. So one of the things we think about is how do they protect themselves? It's going to be pretty easy when we think about sea stars in the sense they can bury themselves, and urchins have all these spines right here. So it may not hurt me by holding it up, picking it up, but if I was to try and bite this animal, these spines probably would do some damage. When we think about some things about how they move around. How are they going to go get their food? And how are they going to get their oxygen? Sea stars have interesting ways of doing that. They do not have a blood circulatory system, but what they do have is a water vascular system. Now, the way they do that is the same as urchins. If they're going to have a mantle, which is going to be an opening at the very top, and they're going to flush the water through that mantle, and it's going to then flush all the way through their arms. Now, sea stars have what we call these food grooves. So the water is going to be able to flush the nutrients through the arms, through these food grooves. And then as you notice coming out on the sea star is going to be these little structures. They look a little bit like tentacles with suction cups at the end, and we're going to call those tube feet. And they're going to have many uses. So besides tube feet, sounds like they would use it for locomotion, being feet, which is true. They're also going to be able to use these feet kind of like receptacles for smell. And then their nervous system is going to be able to detect that odor. So the feet can also be used for locomotion and for smell. And another neat thing is sea stars don't have gills like fish do, but they are marine animals, so they are going to have to take in oxygen somehow. What happens is they have these little like skin gills down at the bottom of their tube feet. So as our water vascular system flushes through the arms, going along the canals in here and flushes along their tube feet, the little skin gills down around the feet are able to extract the oxygen. Now we think, all right, so we know how they're going to smell their food. They're going to use those receptacle tube feet. And then when they get hungry and want to go after something, they're going to move kind of slow. One thing they like to eat are plants. So we think about, even though they move pretty slow, something that's neat is that their oral end right here, they have two stomachs. Most sea stars do have two. That's kind of neat in the fact that one stomach is going to come out. So when they wrap around their prey, they're going to use that water vascular system like a hydraulic force. And it's going to go through their arms. Then they're going to be able to use their 2 feet to grab a hold of that sea star and help pull it apart. So take the oral end, out comes one stomach so that it can start to partially digest the clam on the outside. And then it's going to bring it back into the oral end of the sea star. Then it's going to be able to finish digesting the clam with the second stomach already on the inside. And one thing about this, you think that sounds kind of weird having the 2 stomachs, but when you're opening in, your oral end is that small and your mouth is that small, and you do move pretty slow, it makes sense that you might want to eat a larger prey. And you might want to take some time so you don't have to continuously hunt and find your food. Now, urchins, as you can see these guys right up in here, I'm going to pick this one up here, they also have feet called 2 feet, which are moved for locomotion. They can smell with them. And they can also have little, like, take in the oxygen from them. But one thing different about our urchins around here is that they do have teeth. Now, sea stars don't have teeth. But right here in the middle on the oral end, you can see these little teeth that'll come out. And what happens is they're going to be like little Aristotle's, they're called an Aristotle's lantern, and they'll look like 5 little sharp teeth. We can get them to show you here. Now, what's really interesting about sea urchin's teeth is that they self-sharpen. So as the sea urchin is eating, its teeth self-sharpen itself. And they're also perforated at certain sections. So if it breaks, they can easily continuously grow. So it makes sense that a sea star might need some continuously growing teeth that self-sharpen if you're scraping your food off of rocks, which our urchins around here need to go around the rocks and scrape their food off. So it's really helpful for them to have teeth that continuously grow. Okay, now we want to think about how are these guys a little bit different than, let's say, our Aptasia sea anemones, which we can find growing right out in the Whitney Pond. So our sea anemones are going to be in a phylum called Cnidarian, which we will also find jellyfish, hydroids, and corals. So little differences in how they protect themselves. Cnidarians actually have tentacles with stinging cells at the end. And then for gathering their oxygen through the oral end on the very top, they can bring in the oxygen, and they have little cells at the very opening of the mouth, and these cells can extract the O2 out. Now for feeding, for lactation here, they'll reach out their tentacles and they'll grab a hold of the food. Get that one here. Let's see here. We'll get a smaller piece. See if we can get these guys to. You can see it right there. You can see the tentacles grabbing the food, and as I let go of the shrimp, he's using the little tentacles of the suction at the end of it to hold on to it, and that's going to be the oral end. We're just going to feed these guys here.
So I have a question from
Yes.
the group. So I'm going to see if Pat Harden had raised her hand. I'm going to see if she can give us her question.
We're going to feed these. More. There we go. See, reach out and grab it.
Okay, she'll have to unmute herself if she wants to ask the question, or please go ahead and write into the chat, into the Q&A question box.
Cnidarians are really neat sort of sea anemones when you think about learning about being able to see something, watching the animal eat. When you're talking about how things eat and how are they living together, and even though they all live pretty much in the same environment, some of them eat each other and some don't. Some eat other things. When we look at some of our gastropods right here, which are in a phylum called mollusks, think about our snails, they're the gastropods. Well, they may not eat anemones, but this Florida horse conch here loves to eat other snails, and it loves to eat crown conch. So I'm going to show you what a crown conch looks like. And then, of course, our crown conchs, where they love to eat what's in the environment, they love to eat oysters. So sometimes you'll have right here in the backyard of the Whitney Lab, you'll have oysters, and then you'll have the crown conchs on top of the oysters, and then you'll have horse conchs up around the same area searching for their food too. So a lot of these animals all live together in the same environment. They all have to interact. So the Florida horse conch here is our Florida state shell, and I just learned that it was named the Florida state shell in 1969. So it's a pretty neat marine snail, and the fact that it's going to grow up to about 24 inches at optimal conditions, and it can live over 55 years. Now, when a snail is born, I'll show you that. This, you guys may see this egg casing out on the beach. Hold it right here for you. It looks sort of like a rose or a bunch of upside down triangles, or maybe even those old bugle chips that some people get turned upside down, stuck together. When you see this type of egg casing out on the beach or in the estuary, you know that it came from the horse conch.
Brenda,
Yes.
we had a question.
Yes.
What are the lifespans of some of these creatures? I know you mentioned the horse conch. What about some of the other ones that we're talking about here today?
Okay, so the lifespan of urchins and sea stars, you know, to be honest with you, I'm going to say probably 2 to 5 years. I'll have to look. I'm not for sure. And different species can live different time frames. So when we think about like this Florida horse conch, yes, it can live over 55 years in optimal conditions. But if we compare that to, let's say, our little tiny mud snail, which might be hard to see. I'll do this here for you. All right, so this guy right here, I'm gonna put him up here. He is super little, right? Okay. His lifespan is only about a year. So we may have a 1-year lifespan on this mud snail. We might have a 5-year lifespan on a crown conch. We can go up to the horse conchs, and we can have over a 55-year lifespan. So some of even the same type of animals, snails, will have different lifespans. And just like the sea stars and the urchins, And in order to find out exactly what the lifespans are, you almost have to look up individual species. Because just within our crabs alone and our snails by themselves, each different type can have a different lifespan. So we have anywhere from these marine snails, anywhere from 1 year up to over 55 years for their lifespans. And it's very similar to if you think about their egg casings or even their reproductive behavior. Each type of snail can have a different type of egg casing and a different type of reproductive behavior. So this particular egg casing, which is seen quite a bit on St. Augustine beaches, I'll kind of hold it up to see if you're able to take a look at it. Different little like rounds. Sometimes they'll have a little like indentions on the side, little spikes around it. If I hold it out like this, it looks a little bit like an accordion. Kind of just do it like that. You get the idea. Well, this would be an egg casing that would belong to a lightning whelk. And I do have one lightning whelk right here. It's a smaller one. We're going to hold it up here. So our lightning whelks is another Florida marine species that we have around here for snails. And another interesting thing about the lightning whelks versus all of these other snails we have here is going to be which way do they open. Now, I know a lot of people have been walking on the beaches or you've been places and you've seen different shells, and maybe you've noticed that some open what we call sinistral, which is to the left, and some open dextral, which is to the right. We're going to do this here. I'm going to show you here. Let me show you right here. You can see this, right? You can see there a lightning whelk actually opens up to the right, this way. There you go. And then our horse conch opens up to the left. So now, if you ever find a horse conch or other shell, if you notice they all open up to the left, then you're finding a rare one if they open up to the right.
And Brenda, how do you tell how old, for example, a horse conch is? How would they know that?
All right. It's kind of the same way I would have to find out if I was going to see if it was a male or a female. And in order to do that, we would have to slice it open. We're not going to do that to hurt the animal, but if we could see the inside, we would probably be able to tell by the shell's lining, a better grasp on its age. So when a snail starts out, it's going to start out as a little tiny speck, a little tiny like pinpoint. And then as it starts to develop, it's going to grow its colors. It's going to start, as it develops its calcium here and shell, what's going to happen is every little spire is going to get larger and larger. And you can start to see rings here. It's growing. And one thing I wanted to point out that makes the shell grow is part of the body called the mantle. So it is the animal's mantle that sits here and rubs along the inner part of the shell. And as you can see, the inner part of the shell is really shiny and more colorful. What's going on is it's continuously secreting out nutrients and minerals and calcium to grow the shell. So as the animal grows larger until it reaches a certain age, then it's sexual maturity, then it's going to continue growing the shell. And it's going to continue making this. So it's the mantle. And if you notice this one section right here that's coming out the canal, that's called our siphon. I put him back in the water. And so the horse conch can make its own siphon by taking the mantle, folding it up, and it forms like a straw. The straw, the siphon, is very useful in the sense of in the water, it's going to be waving around. It's going to be able to take in water. It's going to be able to extract the oxygen from the water because marine snails have gills on the inside. And it's also going to be able to smell. And then if any type of snail is interested in something that it smells, it's going to bring out what's called a proboscis to go eat with. So snails also move pretty slow, just like our sea stars and urchins do. And they don't have a bunch of little tiny tube feet. When the snails come out, right, they're bringing this mantle out, they have the first feet is a foot, a large foot and a stomach. So they're going to bring that foot out, and just like any land snail, they're going to have little tiny muscles that ripple from the back of the foot to the front of the foot for movement. One of the reasons why snails can only move forward and not backwards is because of the way the tiny muscles move in the foot. So they have a continuous motion like this. And then since the snails secrete their mucus lining from the top, from the very front of the foot, that's another reason they move forward. So that's something kind of interesting. If you ever watch a snail, you'll never see it go backwards. so it's going to be forward. Now it can turn around, of course. Now we want to think about a few things here. We talked about our snails here, and we know that they're going to be hatched, are going to come out of an egg casing. When they come out of that egg casing, they're going to have their shell, and then as they grow, they're going to continuously grow their shell. If something was to happen and a snail was to get ate or was to die for some reason, then what gets left is the shell. And then what moves into these shells is our little hermit crabs. So snails do make their own shells, and it's the hermit crabs that move into empty shells. And we have a couple of different types of hermit crabs around town. Sometimes we can get these guys to come out. We have some that have like little black stripes that you'll see locally. You'll see ones with red stripes. We have a little flat one with white stripes. And then we have a large red claw hermit crab. So you can see these claws here are definitely much bigger than our little one here on the left here. So these are some neat guys to use. Now they don't have a shell in the sense like our snails do. They're using their shell for protection. But they do have this front, like a little carapace on the front half of their body. So if he comes out, you can notice that his little claws and arms and legs in the front half is covered with a carapace that will molt, almost like a blue crab does or any other type of crab. But it's the back half that doesn't have any protection on it. So they do want to take like their legs and they'll get an empty shell and they'll wrap up in it. And so what happens here is this little guy here then can hide his back half to keep from getting ate. And if a hermit crab outgrows their shell, then they go and find another empty shell to move into. So they're pretty interesting. And we know that hermit crabs here are not gastropods, nor are they in this phylum of mollusks. They're actually arthropods. So they're arthropods because they have jointed legs. Now, another one we have here that's an arthropod. It's going to be our horseshoe crabs. So our horseshoe crabs are arthropods, and they're not true crabs though. They're just named horseshoe crabs because it's a common name that was given to them a long time ago. So they're not really true crabs, but they are arthropods. Now when we look at this underneath half of this horseshoe crab, one thing we can really tell, this is a boy. And one way I can tell it's a boy is that I'm going to be able to look at this very first little like walking leg, and it gets modified into a hook. So if this was a female, that first walking leg would look identical to these other walking legs. Now horseshoe crabs are great in the sense that they don't dry out as fast as just like our little horse conchs here. But the one thing about horseshoe crabs is as long as they stay moist and wet, they can still use these book gills right here to extract the oxygen from. So these little layers right here can be used as their gills. And the first layer underneath it is where the reproductive organs are kept. So if this was a female, that's where, under this first layer is where she would have to keep her eggs. So females can lay eggs a couple times a year. They mostly all do it in spring, but doesn't have to be in the springtime. And when a female lays her eggs, she'll come up on this beach, she'll dig a little hole and drop about 20,000 eggs, little tiny little eggs that birds also love to eat. But she'll drop these eggs, and then she's going to pull the male up or over the little hole, and then the male will fertilize the eggs. So when we talked about the very beginning, when this first little leg here is modified into that hook, that's so that the male can hook on the back of the female. So when she goes up on the sand, she can drag him along. Another way you can tell it's a male is it has a little concave right here. If this was a female, she would have more of a straighter. So let's think about this for a second, right? We know that these horseshoe crabs have this outer carapace for protection, which is this outer shell made of chitin, and they can molt that. And they've got some pretty good looking armor, but I'm not so sure if it's just their armor that's kept them around for over 400 years. When we think about back before the dinosaurs, the horseshoe crabs go through a trilobite larvae stage. The trilobite fossils have been around before the dinosaurs. But one of the things they do think that has kept the horseshoe crab around for so long is the fact that its blue blood, which is copper-based, not iron-based, like our red blood, is able to clot or coagulate the moment it touches some type of bacteria. They've been thinking that perhaps since whenever horseshoe crabs get a scratch and their blood can clot so fast, this has given them an extra layer of protection throughout the millions of years they've been around. So that's interesting, and that's also one of the reasons why we have some of our northeastern labs who use their blue blood in research studies when it comes to our own vaccines and medical equipment that might go inside of a person's body, surgical equipment. Any type of surgical implant can be tested with the blood from horseshoe crab to see if there's any bacteria local presence. Now, I know he's whipping his tail around, looking like he's trying to hurt me with it, but it's not a weapon. The tail here, we call it a telson, is mostly used for a couple different reasons. One is if a horseshoe crab was to bury itself down in the mud or the sand during a hot day, it can actually lift this telson up, and it has hundreds of photoreceptor cells going up and down. Now, photoreceptor cells are like cells that have the potential to be eyes, but they're not true eyes. They're just able to detect some light. So by lifting it up, the horseshoe crab can detect, is it too bright outside? Is it evening? What time of the evening is it? And decide whether or not it wants to come up out of the sand or the mud and go make its way up on the shore, up on the bank there, or not. It can wait a little bit longer. So that's kind of neat that it can just lift it right up. So it's not trying to hurt me with it. And that's another way that the horseshoe crab can protect itself from the hot sun during the daytime.
One of the questions that came up was how old, you said 400, is it millions of years?
Yes, okay. Yes. So think about dinosaurs, pretty much the 250 million years, and then we've seen trilobite fossils listed at 500 million years. That's the oldest that I've seen past the dinosaurs. And so that's what these guys here, when they still have a larvae stage and they go through a trilobite larvae stage. And then after they go through their larvae stage, and then they kind of hatch out of that area, they actually start to look like a horseshoe crab.
Oh. Thank you.
Yes.
So if people have other questions, if you want to put them into the chat, the Q&A now, we'd be happy to answer any other questions. I see the poll is getting some questions here of which animal in your neighborhood is the horseshoe crab closely related to. Looks like the spider is winning.
All right, you guys are right. When you look at it like this, it's a giveaway, the spider. What it is horseshoe crabs are in the class chelicerates instead of the class Brachyuria. Brachyuria would be a true crab. Hermit crabs are in that classification. Fiddler crabs, blue crabs, but the chelicerates we have are horseshoe crabs, and we also have spiders and scorpions. So when we look at that underneath part, it almost looks more like the spider and scorpion than it does any other type of crab. Those are great questions.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you guys. The main thing is just when we're using animals with education programs, it's great in the sense that we want to start thinking and get their brain going, and the questions, what kind of makes it more interesting too. So it's really nice to think about where these animals live and just to start thinking about how they might all survive a little bit differently, even if they live in the exact same areas.
So Brenda, we have another question of how often do the horseshoe crabs molt? Do they stop when they're adults, or how does that work?
From everything I've learned and what I've known and throughout the years, they're going to molt a lot when they're little. And what we've seen is that as they're born, they start to molt. As they start to grow, they're going to molt a lot. And then as they reach sexual maturity, which is about 8 to 10 years, then they're going to slow down the molting. As they get older, they can live up to be at 20 years, 25 years. They're going to continuously slow down. It's kind of like with humans, right? As we young, our skin cells may shed quite a bit and things are, turning pretty fast. But then as we get older, our cells don't maybe necessarily molt as fast.
So when do they reach maturity?
8 to 10 years for sexual maturity.
Great. So if we have any other questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A. I see Phyllis has had some good questions about the horseshoe crab. What are some of the questions that the kids tend to ask you when they're here at our program?
Oh, that's great. That's a good one too. Well, first of all, they all think this is a stingray. The first thing they say is that's a stingray, and that's because of the way the tail looks. And then the moment you turn it over, then we usually get lots of oohs and ahs. Great question. So I'm going to tell you how they eat. So if we notice, we talked about the sea urchins had teeth. The sea stars have those 2 stomachs. Our sea anemones have tentacles, and our snails have a proboscis. But what's these guys right here, what they have is these mantle bases. You'll see these little hairy structures right here. So we call them mantle bases, and it's actually spelled like G-N because the G is silent. And what happens is, as the horseshoe crab has to go along the bottom of the seafloor, it's got to be able to pick up like worms or little shrimp. And so he goes along the bottom and he picks up those mantle bases. And as he keeps going and pushes the food up, those mantle bases work like this. And he just starts kind of munching that food up because he doesn't have any teeth. And so as he keeps walking, and he has to continuously walk as he eats, or there's no way to push the food farther up into his mouth area. So it's those little like hairy looking structures there, grab onto the food, and they, as the horseshoe crab continuously walks, then that's whenever the food gets smashed up and pushed in. Some of the main questions they like to ask about our snails and stuff would be some things like males and female. And we tell the guys that, yeah, we have male and female snails. We may not know if this is a female snail until we see them lay an egg casing. That may be the only way we know it's a female. A lot of the snails can be male and female and be hermaphrodites. That's always a great, interesting type question too. The hermit crabs, a lot of kids, a lot of people don't know if the hermit crabs are not the ones who make the shell. So there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to who makes the shell. Is it the snails or is it the hermit crabs? And a lot of kids, until they start finding out, a lot of people think it is the hermit crabs. So that's always an interesting thing. I think with the anemones, things like knowing that once they attach to something that they can move, they can also release their base, and the anemone can move around. So they do ask if can anemones move, and the answer is yes. The anemone wants to move away from this rock. It can unattach its base, move wherever it wants, and then kind of replant itself. Now, if I try to physically remove the anemone off the rock, I probably would harm it, but it can definitely move by itself.
I have someone who's raised their hand. We're going to try this again. I'm going to allow you to talk, which means you'll have to unmute yourself here. So we've got Charles with a question. Charles, you'll have to unmute yourself.
I don't have a question. I just hit the wrong part of the screen, I think.
Okay, great. We're gonna put that on our Saturday Night Live Zoom episode because it happens. Well, thanks for raising your hand, Charles, and thanks for joining us tonight. I think we've ended our Q&A session at this point, unless anyone had any other questions. We just wanted to thank you for coming this evening, and make sure that you take a look at our upcoming session. We hope you and your families are doing well. We're really glad to see you here at the lab. And even though it's remote, we're glad to share a little bit about what we're doing here. And like I said, more information is available on our website, whitney.ufl.edu. Hope to see you November 12th. And then in December, we also have a wonderful talk coming up. So hope you stay tuned, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.